Hello, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to our last Thinking in a somewhat epic week of Thinkings and an epically hot week as well. Today is Friday lunchtime at Sensemaker Live, and it's not normally me that does this, but we've done a bit of a switcheroo. Claudia, my colleague who is on Team Sensemaker, is in the chat. Hello Claudia, there she is. And the reason why we've swapped around today for Sensemaker Live is because we're having a crack at a topic that's in theory, do you know what, I'm not going to say expert at all, but in my job before I worked for Tortoise, I worked for the Cannes Lions International Festival of Creativity, which is basically the Oscars of the advertising industry, where when the film festival people ship off home, the advertising people ship into town in Cannes and stand around on yachts drinking rosé and congratulating one another on how influential and important they are in the world. And for the last 10 years, a lot of the talk at Cannes Lions has been about something that the marketing industry calls brand purpose. She says deliberately doing the things in the air. And this week, the week we're in now, today, Friday, the 26th of June, would have been the last day of the Cannes Lions International Advertising Festival this year, but of course it's been cancelled because of COVID. So we're having a crack at a topic that is relevant to us all, because advertising and marketing affects everybody in one way or another. And I'm going to have a go at it because of that sort of halfway house background that I have between my journalist hat on and my marketing hat on. It is a thinking like any other. For those of you who haven't done a digital thinking before, we really want to hear what you think on this. So there's two ways that you can join in. You can join in by putting your little blue digital hand up, which you can find if you click participants at the bottom of the screen, or just weigh in on the chat and Claudia will moderate the discussion and pick out interesting points. And I'll bring in as many of you to speak on screen as I can do. We are joined to get us going on this by three really interesting, I think, people who have a particular point of view on this question of not so much anymore whether big brands should respond to the Black Lives Matter protest. I think the conversation moved quite quickly on from that, but how. And what I want to try and get into is beyond this thing of it's important that it's action, not just words, because kind of so far so obvious. I really want to understand what are the nature of the decision-making processes and how, as either people working inside of those organizations or consumers, we can navigate what is a sort of inherently hypocritical situation that we're all in. If you're a big brand or a big business, you've necessarily benefited from a system that is, without wishing to put too fine a point on it, racist. And so now we're at a moment of change. How do we navigate this time, which is everything's not fine yet, we're working towards that. So how do we get that right in our marketing, particularly in our advertising communications and so on and so forth. So perhaps to kick us off, I'm going to go to Bex Collins. And I came across Bex while researching this and chatting to my colleague Polly about the fact we were going to have this conversation. And Bex has written, she's a researcher, a semiotician by trade, but has been writing for the Marketing Society some quite influential blog posts that have been picked up by The Guardian and others about how big brands have been responding in public with their comms to the Black Lives Matter protest, and has some, I think, fascinating insights to share, not just about the philosophy of what is right and wrong, but also the specifics of who's done a good job and who hasn't. Bex, would you just kind of open the bidding? You did say I might just start ranting, and I said that was fine. So the floor is yours.
So I have been slightly ranting in these pieces for the Marketing Society, and I think most of that comes from the fact that in my work as a semiotician working with brands, I've essentially been spending the last 10 years telling brands what they need to do to connect better with consumers, but also increasingly to live up to these brand purposes that they say that they have. So brands have been spending quite a lot of money in sort of determining these brand purposes, quite often that are to do with things like community or helping the environment and things like that. But then when I sort of go to them, okay, you know, this is the way that culture is changing. And if you want to live up to these, this is what you need to do. You need to be more sustainable, or you need to actively benefit communities. They don't want to invest in these sort of what they consider to be long-term things. They want the quick wins. So then when we come to something like Black Lives Matter, and brands are sort of essentially kind of freaking out a little bit about what they should be doing, it's incredibly frustrating, because for ages they've been saying that they want to sort of benefit communities, but then at the very least they sort of won't put their money where their mouth is quite a lot of the time when it comes to something like Black Lives Matter, because they're worried about being seen as hypocritical, that they'll be called up for not having, done these things in the past. And the analogy that I've been sort of saying to them is, when you have, for example, a homophobic family, you don't sort of, and you want the change. You don't, when one uncle, for example, goes to Pride, you don't then go, oh, but the rest of your family is terrible and they're homophobic, and that therefore sort of means that your foray into Pride and your journey of acceptance isn't valid. It means that we're happy that you're joining the conversation. We're happy that you're doing something. And it was really sort of worrying that it took a lot of brands quite a long time, weeks in some places, to actually sort of speak up about Black Lives Matter, when essentially that says so much that it's actually hard for brands to say they are anti-racist. And if it's hard for you to say you're anti-racist, what does that mean about what your brand is? If you're worried about alienating your customers by saying you're anti-racist, who are your customers? And are you really living up to the brand purpose you say that you have? So that's where I've sort of been coming from, with a sort of semiotic side, but also pushing towards, like, I've been telling brands for years to actually do things, and it's frustrating that it's still taking them this long.
Yeah, thank you, Bex. I wonder if you might just quickly share with those people who might not have heard about it, the story of the teas. Did you write about, so Yorkshire Tea, there was some horrendous racist posted on Twitter, I'm so pleased Yorkshire Tea hasn't come out in support of Black Lives Matter. And then Yorkshire Tea said something. You sort of talked about that in one of your posts, that the tea thing had all unravelled.
So I was contacted by The Guardian to essentially sort of comment on what happened with the tea. So Yorkshire Tea and PG Tips responded to a racist person saying, like, oh, I'm so glad that you didn't say anything about Black Lives Matter. I'm happy to be drinking your tea. And they went, no, actually, we are pro Black Lives Matter, and you go drink some racist tea somewhere else. Yeah. One of the things that's quite frustrating about that is that everybody sort of went, oh, these teas have done so well, look at Yorkshire Tea, they're so anti-racist. And I was like, it still took them 2 weeks to say anything, and when they did, it was when they were being branded as racist by someone. And they then, that's not a proactive stance. And they haven't done a huge amount since then to actually sort of stand by it. They've just gone, hey, no, we're actually anti-racist. Yeah. And so we need to be sort of careful when we lift people up and sort of say, oh, you've done this amazing thing. One tweet isn't going to prove, it's better than nothing, but it doesn't essentially, make everything perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a brilliant scene setter, I think, Bex, because one of the things I want to get into, and I'm going to come to Asad in a second, is this sense of pace. So a statement in support is kind of entry level anti-racism, and then clearly there's a whole sequence of things that needs to come after that. But I'm really interested in how organizations big and small can, and actually consumers, to be fair as well, can get a sense of what is an acceptable rate of progress. What are the things that need to happen now, and how can we kind of monitor and keep track of that? Asad, I'm going to come to you if I can. Asad Duna is the founder of The Unmistakable's, a very much lauded, award-winning consultancy that works specifically in this space, and is a great friend of Tortoise. Thanks so much for being here, Asad. And you, because of the nature of what The Unmistakable's does, you're there to help on seemingly sticky situations that companies are in, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So The Unmistakable's, we're a consultancy that makes diversity everyone's business, and we've been doing this for, well, I set up the business 2 years ago, coincidentally from the same desk that I'm now sat at, given we're in lockdown. But similarly to Bex, this is something that has been a big passion point for mine throughout my career, of looking at diversity, different people in organizations, and how that works through the ranks, and how does diversity really work. And I think D&I in a term became a buzzword, and no one really knew what to do about it, because it's all about your personal journey. It's very, very personal for a lot of people. And I think, just to reflect on the question you had about what's an acceptable rate of progress. So I have a comms background. I was a volunteer comms director for Pride in London. I looked after PR for Netflix and HSBC through my previous job. So there's an expectation to react at pace when it comes to comms, because the consumer doesn't stop and Twitter doesn't stop. Yeah. So when that is fueling, people feel like they have to say something quickly, because it's make the problem go away. And what we had was a cluster of changes in society. So we had COVID making everyone really reflective. You've got everyone working at home, therefore not able to have chat by the water cooler, or passing moments where you can talk about things like race, or you can talk about things like identity. And then you had the very visual moment of George Floyd being killed on May 25th. So all of that put together then turned us on to this fact that racism is a thing. But we've known this for a long, long time. We just haven't seen it in mainstream society. And I'll give you an example of how that's played out. So we have done some analysis on the term BAME, which is Black, Asian and Minority Ethnicity. There's problems with that term, because BAME, when the question is Black, the answer cannot be BAME. Yeah. So when Matt Hancock was asked, are there any Black people in your cabinet, and said, well, we've got Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak, that's not the answer, because they're not Black. And so we analysed that term BAME, and what we saw was, on average, every week you'd have maybe 150 to 200 mentions of the term BAME in mainstream media. Then when lockdown happened, that sunk to about 100, because everyone was talking about sourdough, making sourdough, and they were talking about toilet roll. And then we started to see the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black, Asian and minority ethnicity, people of that background. And then George Floyd happened. So it's kind of, I've written about this on our blog, which is you see the curve go like that and then spike. And then we got to a point where there are 1,000 mentions of the term BAME in that last week of May, first week of June. So you went from 100 to 1,000 in the state of 2 months. And so I think all of these things have added together for how people respond. Now, if you wanted my professional opinion of how to get there, I believe that brands need to earn the right to respond to something as deep and intrinsic as racism. Someone here has talked about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's. Like, the reason why racism or latent racism has been brewing in a system like brands and marketing is because it doesn't attract and retain people who are different. So the decision makers around a table at every level don't have the capability, because the people aren't at the table, to think differently and think diversely. And that's where I think there's a huge benefit in diversity. It's not about a nice to have, let's tick a box. It's about rewiring systems and structures, which is hard work for a brand, especially when you're trying to do that in the context of COVID and you don't even know if you're going back into the office.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. The practical challenges, if you are somebody who's sitting in a comms team or whatever, I guess are real, not really challenges, dilemmas, I suppose. But I want to stick with this thread about advertising and marketing not attracting people who are different, if you like. I'm going to come to Belinda. Belinda, good morning. You're in New York. Thank you very much for getting up at the crack of dawn. It's lovely to see you. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Belinda Smith is the Global Diversity Ambassador for the World Federation of Advertisers, who sort of represent the biggest advertisers in the world, the Procter and Gambles and the Unilevers of this world, huge organisations with billions and billions of dollars and pounds to spend on advertising. And you have yourself had a stellar career in really senior marketing positions in Electronic Arts most recently, and lots of other big global marketing advertising companies. And I was really taken when we chatted on the phone the other day, Belinda, by a story that you told about being in the executive board meeting for, it may have been the WFA or it may have been EA, I'm not sure where, and you sort of had to, there was a big lot of self-congratulatory chat going on about gender diversity and progress in that field, and you had to kind of just put the brakes on a little bit to that conversation. Would you mind sort of sharing a bit about what that felt like?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. It always feels very strange to be the lone American accent on a panel. That story was actually from the WFA. The WFA has a really robust partnership with UN Women and the Unstereotype Alliance. And I sat on the WFA's executive committee a few years ago as part of my role at EA. And yes, during one of our quarterly executive meetings, we were talking about diversity, and everyone was kind of pouring through what we've done with the See Her campaigns, with Unstereotype Alliance, with UN Women. And then the question was, okay, that's great. How are we going to take this forward? And everything around that table was really focused on gender, because that's where we had been in the past. And yeah, my very direct voice was, I don't really care about gender so much, because when we talk about gender initiatives under the umbrella of diversity, what we're talking about is white women. And usually what we're talking about is already socially economic privileged and well-networked and connected white women. And so you kind of reach for the closest white woman next to you, you give her an executive title, and you think that you've solved diversity. And my challenge, as you said, WFA is some of the world's biggest brands and advertisers. And I told every executive at that table, I will consider it a massive fail and such a waste if we decide to do something in diversity and we are not brave enough to talk about Black people, and we are not brave enough to talk about racial diversity and ethnic minorities. And that's the point of having all of this power set at one table. And that was really, I think, the inception of us thinking about how we are more inclusive and how we talk about diversity, and not focusing in on one characteristic. And as we know, intersectionality plays a big role in that as well. But it's been my experience throughout my career in advertising that people have really struggled to say the word Black. It makes them so uncomfortable. And I think that's a little bit of that was on display, where companies wanted to show support for a movement. But I mean, to have your brand say the word Black, let alone say Black Lives Matter, is really nerve-wracking for a lot of brands, which is super unfortunate.
Yeah. What do you think, Belinda, about this moment of hypocrisy that brands are caught in? Because no company, not nobody, but no company has done enough, whatever enough might be defined as. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. And yet, sort of as a marketer, and you'll know this, and I remember it from my days as one too. Sort of lessons 1, 2, and 3 of your brand purpose or your mission or whatever is, it's got to be authentic. You can't fake it, and consumers are too smart and they'll see through it and whatever. So a commitment to change now, knowing that in the tea example, you have real issues in your supply chain. You might know that you have no Black representation on your senior leadership team, and any number of other huge things in the midst of that. How can marketing and communications people in particular navigate that moment in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is this only has to be a moment of hypocrisy for brands if you're a racist brand. If you're not a racist brand, if you don't support white supremacy, then I don't know that it's necessarily a moment of hypocrisy. My view of this entire past few weeks has been really optimistic. Again, as a Black employee and as a Black senior leader on senior leadership teams, It feels really awful to not be acknowledged or prioritized, or for people to pretend that you are on even footing with the rest of the organization, which is untrue. Yeah. So I'm very inspired that people have made statements and, you know, black squares or memes or fists in the air or whatever it is. And that's a starting point. And from my perspective, everybody deserves a fresh start. Like, I'm willing to give every single person who made a statement the benefit of the doubt. And I'm willing to believe that today is day one and you're ready to move forward in a positive way. If that turns out not to be true, that's no fault but your own. That's no fault but your leadership team. There's nothing in the world that's preventing you from not being a racist at this point. So, you know, those actions look different for each brand. And for some management teams, I mean, my experience in advertising is that for all management teams, it's actually a look at inclusivity. The reason that you don't have Black talent is because you have an abusive and hostile workplace for Black employees. And so that's step one, is to figure out, how do we make working here a less awful experience? Something that I've been challenging brands to do here on the US side is get rid of the use of NDAs. You should never exit or settle the end of an employment relationship with a non-disclosure agreement. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And that is a tool that supports white supremacy. So there are many actions that you can take. Supply chain diversity, looking at the makeup of your executive staff, releasing your diversity numbers. I think these are all great. But first and foremost, my concern is I will never be supportive of placing Black bodies into white cultures that are abusive to them.
Yeah.
So if you can't say that about your business, about your company, about your agency, about your brand right now, then I think that's actually step one.
Yeah. Thank you. Got it. I'm going to come now to a couple of people in the chat. Yasmin, I know, is a regular contributor on Thinkins, raising important messages about the sort of difference between, we are talking about brands and communications, but you know, the story is kind of one thing and the reality is over here. And then perhaps Maya, and then I do want to come to Susie, because Susie's got some interesting other data that I think would be interesting to share. But Yasmin, are you there? Can we hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hey, thank you for always being generous with the platform. It's just a quick point that I always find interesting when there's a conversation around the brand, like, is this brand racist, or is this, you know, is this social media post the right thing to do? And I think part of the tension is the difference between the message that you're putting out and then the reality on the ground. And like, there is a limit between how good a story your brand can tell and then what is actually happening in your company. Like, Nike is an example of a brand that does really well with its, you know, with supporting Colin Kaepernick and, you know, putting all the right kind of marketing content out there. And it is a brand really loved by a lot of Black and brown people in English-speaking Anglo countries and around the world. But also when you kind of look at the organization and how it treats Black and brown people who, you know, manufacture the clothing and manufacture the shoes and that kind of thing, it's not anti-racist to its core. Otherwise, it would have very different policies. And so it can have an anti-racist kind of branding. But I think thinking about, is your focus on the story you're telling, or is your focus on the like DNA of your company? And those are kind of different conversations. And also people who are working in the branding and marketing department maybe don't always have the power to change all of the DNA of the organization. And I think that's part of the challenge as well, is the kind of the limits that people in marketing and comms have to deeply influence the DNA of the organization.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I felt that in some instances, the statements that were being issued, it seemed like this had come out of being a problem for the communications team to solve and into the proper legit boardroom. Yeah, it felt like in some companies we'd got to that point, but not all. I wonder what you might think, Yasmin, about this. So we had a think-in last week with a whole bunch of really young Tortoise members who are expressing, I think, legitimate and not inconsiderable, genuine anxiety about the feeling that they wanted to vote with their pound, you know, support brands that they felt were doing better and not buy from brands that were not getting it. And there was a genuine question, and I don't know, so I'm asking what you think about Ben and Jerry's. So Ben and Jerry's famously and much lauded recently for being on the front foot with this. They've had a kind of director of social activism since 2012, but Ben and Jerry's is owned by Unilever, and Unilever, has a much more complex track record and sells, skin whitening creams and stuff like that. And there was genuine sort of anxiety being expressed by these young people, which is, I just don't really know, how do I know if I'm not accidentally supporting a system that I want to try and dismantle? As consumers, it seems quite difficult to know how to navigate that, to me.
And I think I think part of what you're pointing to is this unfair expectation that consumers have to make all these decisions themselves. Like, the reality is that as a consumer, I can't do the research on every single organization and company that I buy from to see if they're, ethical. Like, we allow organizations and companies to get away with so much, and then me as a consumer, I have to then do so much extra work just to make ethical choices. I think that the pushing of decisions and the pushing of responsibility on individual consumers, especially young people who are just trying to do the right thing, is representative of a much deeper problem. And I saw a comment in the chat that kind of talked about how much risk a company is taking. And I do think there is credit to be given for a brand that takes a little bit of risk. The question is, how much risk is a brand willing to take? And how much. And I mean, like, I don't use Amazon. That makes life really hard for me in lots of different ways, but I've made that choice, right? Yeah. But not everyone can make that choice. And I think making things easier for us more broadly is something that, I think regulation, I think there are all sorts of different mechanisms that we can use, but I don't think that we should have every single thing needs to be an individual responsibility, because we can't function that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to butt into this conversation.
No, please.
The first thing I want to say back to the Nike example is, I would never have known how atrocious Nike was to women, how atrocious Nike was to pregnant athletes, if they had never made a statement about how good they are as a company. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very important for us to continue pushing companies in the right way to make these commitments, because then we can surface what's really going on. So something that was that made me personally very angry was the Refinery29 scandal that happened, because I read Refinery29 unbothered, and the way that brand is positioned, I thought they supported Black women. Mm-hmm. So when the story about how Refinery29 treats Black women came out only in their wake of solidarity with Black Lives Matter, now I have a much better understanding of where not to put my advertising spend, of where I need to unsubscribe, of where I'm no longer consuming content. So the reason that I say I get very excited for companies to release statements is because I as a consumer am never going to know how you treat your newsroom, but if you as a brand bring this conversation to the fore, well, now you are inviting us to scrutinize you. And I think that's a very positive thing. In the same token, I strongly believe, and this is why I work with the WFA on this topic, I fully believe the marketing department can change the entire company. The marketing department creates the brand. It sets the tone for the brand. It controls your customer relationships. The marketing department can force your hand in a bunch of uncomfortable ways that actually seem like a really good idea in a board meeting. And then the rest of your company has to catch up and has to walk that walk and has to live in that. So I just wanted to interject and say that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Belinda and Yasmin as well. I'm going to come to Maya, because you've had your little blue hand up for a long time. Then I'm going to come back to Asad, because I know he's bursting to way back in as well. So Maya, are you there? Maya Campbell.
Hi. Yeah. I found what Belinda was saying was really interesting. And it reminded me of, I don't know whether any of you have seen it, the pull up or shut up movement on Instagram. They're essentially contacting companies and saying, we want some transparency. Will you, give us the information on the makeup of your C-suite? And if they do, they say, okay, well, this is where you're at, thanks for sharing. And if they don't, it's like, okay, you refuse transparency, that's good to know too. And I think initiatives like that are going to, you know, force companies to think a lot harder about, you know, actively being anti-racist for fear of being, you know, called out when things happen. But I think that it really varies company to company, particularly the extent to which the marketing department can have a steer on that. I mean, I work in legal brand and legal marketing, and I think that it really differs firm to firm or company to company, the extent to which the CMO or whoever has a look in at C-suite level. And if you don't have that representation at C-suite level, and you know, you also don't have anybody saying, well, this is what the market is telling us, then it's so easy to see why they missed the mark and why they will continue to miss the mark. So for me, it's, you know, talking about brand is a little bit like, you know, without talking about the structural inequality, it's a bit about like talking about the horse after it's bolted, because without the representation in the decision making, it's just not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. I agree. It definitely feels like the sort of forces for good around the table, that the nature of that conversation is very variable. Let's come back to Asad, and then I'm going to go to Susie because she's going to share some more data. Asad, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I guess there were two things that came up that struck me, which was that if you think about this from a really human level and think about people as they move through life, you see changes. And I'm basing this on some work I did years ago with Microsoft, where we looked at the C-suite and how do you get to the C-suite and what happens in life broadly, and it's a very broad brush. People start life extrinsically motivated. They care about the world and what's going on around them. And then as you move through life, let's say late 20s, early 30s, there's a gradual shift into being more intrinsically motivated because you care more for the family that you're creating, for the home that you're creating. So then if you think about that with C-suites containing lots of intrinsically motivated individuals who have become that way because of the function of life and aging, then you start to say, well, actually, how do you pull back that view that we need to be more extrinsically motivated? And I would layer that with Gen Z because they are extrinsically motivated, and I think the markers of what they do want and will want and want from their lives are not based on ownership principles, which previous people who are on boards, who are Gen X and intrinsically motivated, are struggling to unwind and understand. And I think that's the point around marketing's power, because over the years, marketing has been labeled as the colouring in department, as the team that looks fancy, and everyone has moved within marketing broadly, and you'll know this, Liz, you're nodding, more towards this communications output. Marketing is a communications output rather than a way to change products and to change behaviors and to understand people. And so in the work that we do, we talk about becoming inclusive by design, because you cannot be inclusive by impulse. You can't just say, I'm going to be inclusive now because I have to be. You've got to design all the structures and systems and processes so that it does bring different people around the table. And the best person to hear from of this is June Sarpong, who's the creative director for diversity at the BBC. And she said, it's not all about Black people on the board. It's about representation at every single decision-making layer of the business. That goes way beyond marketing. That hits HR, that hits operations, that hits ultimately how a CEO structures their business. And I know as someone structuring a business from scratch, we've got a lot of luck because it's a blank piece of paper to build something that is inclusive. But the agencies and the marketers haven't got that.
Yeah, interesting. That thing about intrinsically motivated mindset kind of setting in when you hit your, I guess, 30s, 40s, the family life stage is fascinating. Would it be your hypothesis, Asad, that the people who are at the moment Gen Z, so extrinsically, are they going to graduate into that intrinsic mindset, or do we just not know? Like,
there's a few trends that are happening that would suggest not. I think social media has meant they cannot become a Daily Mail reader, or they cannot become attached to one type of media, which creates that intrinsic motivating factor. I think also, if you think about people who remain extrinsically motivated through life, they tend to be from minority or diverse groups. So LGBT people who might not have kids may be more involved in charities, trustees at charities, in arts, in culture, because you see that over time. So I think the fact that Gen Z do identify more queer than the previous generation, again, suggests that that happen. I don't think we can stop it completely. I think it's human nature, but I think there are enough trends to suggest in terms of how we process society and how technology keeps us more open, that real global movements like Pride, like Black Lives Matter, have shown the way to structure the world. But big existing organizations have to structure into EMEA, MIA, all of these groupings that happen that have been broken down. So I'm hopeful. I mean, we've got a young person on our team, Laker, and she's like that. She's the future, I think. But again, kind of established companies struggle with younger people to understand their motivations.
Everybody needs a Laker, or
everyone needs a Laker.
1,000 of them. Thanks so much, Asad. Bex has had her hand up, so we're going to come back to her after speaking to Susie, and I can see that Consolata has got a hand up as well in the participants. But if we can go to Susie. Susie works at Cannes Lions. Hi, Suze.
Hey.
And is skiving off of the virtual version of the festival to come and join a thinking. But so I'm obsessed, because I used to be a marketer. I'm obsessed with counting and measuring things. If your job is, if you're any halfway decent marketer, your job is to grow the company and you represent the voice of the customer. So I like to count and measure, and the counting and measuring is a way of knowing if you're making progress, because you think, well, we're at 0 today, and if we're at 1 tomorrow, then we've done better. And there's some stuff about about new data that's come out, not from Unstereotype Alliance, but from the Gina Davis Institute, that's looked at the first time intersectional representation in advertising. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So we at Cannes Lions, we're kind of in a funny position because we're a media platform, but we work exclusively with the advertising and marketing industry. We've been working with the Gina Davis Institute on gender in media for the last 4 or 5 years. And yesterday we co-presented some original research, which is on intersectional representation. And it's kind of the first of its kind, looking at a large sample of advertising films across 6 different measures. So gender, race, LGBTQ, body size, age and disability, and from 2006 to 2019. And actually just really surprised by how dismal the results were. And, you know, echoing that thing of, you know, it seems like there's been a lot of work done and there's been a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion in the industry, but actually when you look at the hard data, the results just aren't there. So just a couple of examples. So the stats show that the number of characters and screen time, so gender-wise, so women versus men, for women it actually peaked back in 2014. We've gone backwards since then. And we released a study 2 years ago in 2017 that was a bit of a wake-up call. You know, the headline was, there's been no improvement over gender representation for 10 years. We thought that would be a bit of a wake-up call for the industry, and actually there's just been no improvement since then at all. In terms of race, you know, there has been a positive move in representation since 2006, thank God. So 38% of characters are Black, Asian, minority ethnic versus 25.9% in 2006. But what's really disappointing is when you start to look at the character traits given to those characters on screen, they're really stereotypical and just as bad as they were 13 years ago. So characters of colour are twice as likely to be depicted exercising. And so, you know, we're kind of thinking about steps forward. What is the message to the industry? You know, because when you break down the facts and figures, you can see there's just not really any improvement in front of the camera. And, you know, as people have been saying, the answer is behind the camera. You know, we've had these attention grabbing CSR campaigns, say like The Talk and Like a Girl, but really it has to be every piece of marketing that goes out, every piece of advertising needs to have diversity inclusion like baked into it, not just the bit on the side. And the same with the diversity inclusion officer. You know, great to have one, but it's not just a bit on the side, it has to be in the DNA of the business. And like Maya said, it's got to come from the top, but advertising, it's got to be the whole ecosystem. So strategy, creative, the way the client briefs, you know, the way the creatives react to the brief, scripts, casting, production, you know, it's all important. And it's just this whole ecosystem has got to shift really in some way if we're going to see any kind of progress in the next 10 years.
So to be clear, that's about representation in the advert. So who are the people that are doing the adverts, what they're doing, and so on. And so if that's the first time that any sort of intersectional benchmarking has been done, I guess, on a sample of adverts, will it be, it's like an annual thing and it's shared between the industry? Like, how does something like that become practically useful?
Yeah, so we're members of the Unstereotype Alliance as well. So is the Gina Davis Institute, and we, it is a brilliant platform. It's a brilliant organisation, that has very noble aspirations. So, and slowly I think we're getting there. But I think the answer is, there has to be more data. There's got to be more research, and leaders have to understand that it's very important for their business, but also the welfare of their employees and their consumers. It's the message doesn't seem to have got through, and it feels like this is a bit of a turning point this year, with everything that's happened. But yeah, we redo this research every year and release it during Cannes, and we often have sessions on stage. We've got one coming up next week that you can check out for free on our platform, and you can actually download the report as well for free as well, either on our website or the Unstereotype Alliance.
There's some people asking in the chat whether the study, the Gina Davis data, is it in the public domain? Like, can anyone see it?
Yeah, the study it's available now. I'll put a link. Shall I put a link in the chat to it, and you can download it there? Yeah,
that would be very helpful. Thank you very much. Let's go back to Bex Collins. Are you there, Bex? Sorry, I know you had your hand up a while ago.
Hang on. Yes.
Oh,
okay.
Yes,
Hi. Yeah, just to follow on that point about research, we really need to be careful about who is actually doing the research, and think about who the demographic and the diversity of those who are actually creating the research. I work in research, and when I was freelancing, I started my career freelancing, so I didn't really have a sort of perception of what the sort of the industry was like. And then when I joined my first agency, when I had my sort of introductory interview, they said like, oh, we're really aware that we're 100% white, so we're really excited to have you on. And I started laughing because I am biracial, but I'm pretty light. And I have benefited from the privilege that comes with that. And if this is, there's something that they're getting excited about, you realize that that's a big problem that we're having. If we're the people who are essentially advising brands on what to do, if we are all white, that is a massive problem. No matter how unbiased we think we are. My current agency, we're all either women or queer, and I'm both, but I'm still the only person remotely of color. And I keep sort of saying it's going to affect what we say, and we need to bring people into the advisory sort of areas. Like when the Pepsi debacle came out, and everyone in my agency was like, how on earth did this happen? I was like, well, I can tell you how this happened. They didn't, even look at us. If they got us in and I didn't work on it, it might have still happened. I didn't sort of say that because they'd be horrified, but we have to be aware of every single layer of how things get made.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. So we've got a few hands up now. I'll try and get through them all in the last 16 minutes. Consolata has had a hand up for a while. Are you there?
Hello.
Hi, Consolata. Nice to see you.
Hello. So my point touches on something I think Assad raised earlier, and also something I think that Bex has just raised. Partly, I think one of the issues that we have is that at this moment of great reckoning, there's great opportunity, but there's also a chance that brands could also veer into just doing lip service, even in terms of their diversity hires, and I think it's very important that when they are recruiting, like even as Bex was saying, it's not just because you're going to be the token person that we're going to ask all the questions about issues of race or other issues. And I think it's very important also to think about the pipeline as well, because especially in lots of roles, especially maybe in creative and marketing, there's not as many people from diverse backgrounds who are there. But actually, as Assad is pointing out, when the careers are moving forward and going up and higher up the ranks and up into the C-suite, that's what kind of also influences the decisions that are made. So having representation across all levels is key, but also making sure there's adequate support and not just lip service is very important.
Yes, thank you very much. I completely agree. What do you do? Do you work in marketing and advertising, Consolata?
No, I work in higher education, which is a bit different as well. But I think, observing how these things are, it's more of an interest issue. And I think the point that was raised earlier about being very conscious about what you consume and where you're consuming, like now in my groups of friends, we're saying, the the businesses that we buy stuff from, are they representative? If they're not, we're going to use our money elsewhere and help build the economy in other ways as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Beautifully, eloquently made point. Let's go to Helena and then back to Belinda if we can. Hi, Helena.
Hello, Liz.
Hiya.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a point that I raised in the chat earlier, and I think Susie touched on it as well, talking about the need for reform basically across the ecosystem. And I think when you talk about ethical issues in this way, we as consumers can seem quite powerless, because brands will always be sort of contradictory and will effectively try and present themselves in a way that is as positive as possible. So I think rather than demanding certain practices of brands, whether that's to do with the racial and ethnic makeup of their boards and things like that, it's actually more powerful and effective in the long term to demand transparency from brands and transparency across their supply chains. And I think on our part, that means being more skeptical consumers. So for instance, I've just finished making a podcast series about sustainability in the textile industry. Specific to India and China, and it looks at issues across the whole supply chain from production to consumption. And greenwashing is a perfect example of this, right? So brands like H&M Conscious, they can use really low percentages of sustainable cotton and then market their t-shirt as being, you know, a sustainable cotton t-shirt. And knowing something like that and interrogating something like that can be as easy as looking at the tag. And obviously that isn't the case for more complex issues surrounding race and ethnicity, but also gender, all these other things that play into sustainability.
Yeah.
And also that have different cultural significance across these international supply chains. So I think in terms of being a sustainable consumer, the best thing you can do is really to put your pound behind brands that are more open. And Belinda talks about this with respect to Nike, like don't support black brands or interrogate brands that are making flamboyant claims. And that goes across sustainability issues, like interrogate when IKEA say that they're going to be fully circular by 2030. What exactly does that mean? Yeah. And I think, to be honest, I know that it is demanding to look into these things in more depth, but if you start with these kind of over flamboyant claims and go in from that, then that's a kind of easy route into being a more critical consumer and supporting ultimately more sustainable brands.
Thank you, Helena. I definitely feel that requiring transparency is an achievable near-term thing, given that actually unpicking, you know, layer upon layer upon layer of structural and institutional racism is going to take more than a couple of months worth of Instagram posts to solve the problem properly. I suppose my worry, and I'm wary of drawing a direct comparison because I don't think it's the same, but my worry is if we take the example of the gender pay gap legislation that required companies over a certain size, in this country anyway, to publish the difference between what men and women are paid, is that it's the data is only as good as the environment into which it lands, right? And so the amount of obfuscation and mealy mouth, we've got a working group, and you know, it's incredibly easy to sort of game that. So whilst I think that ask for transparency, I'm totally with you, is right, and as a step in the right direction for sure, my worry is that the story is always can often be just a little bit more complicated than the data that comes back. But yes, I hear you absolutely. Let's go back to Belinda with your little blue hand up. Belinda. Hi.
I finally figured out how to do that. I agree with something that was said earlier. I think it was Yasmin who said it. It's not the right solution for us to expect that each consumer is making this decision in a purchasing moment based on perfect information across all firms. And I think something that makes it difficult for people with good intentions to make progress in this issue is it feels overwhelming. It just feels like there's so much that we need to address. And, you know, you get a win with a Kaepernick ad, but then you fall back down with an internal policy. You get a win because Ben & Jerry's, you know, is anti-racist, but then you think actually the product they sell is poisoning low income and disproportionately Black and brown people anyway. So is that good or is that bad? I really think that most of these issues center in the core of who's working at the brand and what is the culture of the brand. I have been in many brands, either, you know, as their agency or as their consultant or just as an employee, where they have a diverse leadership team and the culture is atrocious. It's toxic. And they would, with a diverse team, still make the Kendall Jenner ad. And the reason they would is because when someone puts their hand up and says, oh, I think this isn't a good idea, have you thought about these 3 points? If that person's not from a majority culture, they're ignored. Or if that person has that experience more than twice, they say, gosh, this is going to be a really terrible idea, but no one's going to listen to me anyway.
Yeah.
And I'm not really going to risk putting my neck out there because I know that my feedback isn't valued at this place. So I really think it's 2 crucial things are a massive unlock for everything that follows, which is, what is your culture? Not just what do the people that work for you look like? How do you listen to them? How do you empower them? How do you help them impact the work and make it better? How do you hold people accountable? I firmly believe that not nearly enough people get fired, and many more people should be fired, especially around issues of diversity, but that's another story. So 1 is, what is your culture? And then 2 is, are you bringing a good representation of voices to the table? And by the way, that doesn't have to be that you have perfect representation across your employee base. You have agencies, you have consultants, you have vendors, you have boards, you have many different places in the world that you can seek to get advice and to find this information. But if you don't have an inclusive culture that enables you to humbly listen to different opinions outside of your cultural majority, then it doesn't matter anyway. So I often feel overwhelmed, or maybe even a little pessimistic when I think about all the things in the world that have to be fixed. But really, I believe that if we can get those 2 things sorted, and if you can have transparency on those 2 issues, it really starts to flow and starts to unlock many of the other things that we've been talking about today.
Yes, thanks so much, Belinda. Asad, Little Blue Hand. Can I just say, this is the best use of the Little Blue Hand of any lineup of speakers we've ever had. So shout out to the marketing people who can get down with the technology. Go for it, Asad.
I just wanted to offer an observation around data, which is often people use data to back up what they already know, or they use it to find something new. And in the case of diversity, I think more often than not, it's the former. We know that this is a problem. We don't necessarily need the stat to do it. And then when we get the stat, what you find from people who are more diverse, whatever you want to call it, you find that we knew this for a long time and the data doesn't give you enough depth. So to say that there's 38% BAME people in advertising is great, but how many of that is Black? How many of that is brown? How many of that is East Asian? And how are we breaking that down? I would just offer a bit of like caveat emptor to people who are relying on data. And I think C-suites and boards do rely on data a lot. That trend has happened over 10 years. But you have to pair that with the lived experience. And I think, as Edmund said in the chat, you've got to work it through the capitalist system. One of the best things I heard from Claire Fox, who has been on Think-Ins before and hosts the Battle of Ideas, someone on that panel who is a Marxist said that the challenge with corporations is that they are not democracies. And if you do not have a democracy, you cannot have real diversity and inclusion, because there has to be another hand that's doing it. It can't be that. Now, I think companies are getting there in the triple bottom line, and moving beyond pure profits. And I think consumers and younger people are driving that. But I do think that's the key to the unlock, because the data to say there are more Black and brown faces in adverts is fine, but until you see Black and brown people buying the ads, not being exploited, to Belinda's point, then there's no point in having those faces there.
Yeah. I'm going to come, I hope that Rue is there. I just private messaged to see if you were able to come on. Rue Stenning, who is in the chat. Rue, are you able to come on and just share a bit of what you're talking about? Is Rue there? We could just hear you. If you haven't got your video, we can hear your voice.
Yeah.
Hello?
Hello.
Hey, Rue. Hi, Rue.
If it's okay, this is Rue's son, Siddharth.
Oh, if Rue's available to chat about some of the things.
It was Siddharth's question, actually.
Go for it.
John, Siddharth, what do you want to say?
Yeah, so So Janina mentioned greenwashing.
Yeah.
And something I think I've been noticing, and was in an article I read the other day, is like some people are calling it blackwashing. Is that so for example, in lockdown, people were relying on Amazon more, so they were facing much more intense scrutiny of how they treat their workers. And then they come out and announce this package of how they're going to deal with Black Lives Matter, and they like post a black square on Instagram. Are there other brands that are sort of using Black Lives Matter as a way of turning the conversation away from issues that they specifically are facing and they specifically can solve, as a way of saying, well, look, no one's perfect, no one's like, you still haven't solved this, so if you tell us to improve our practices in relation to our workforce, then you're hypocritical as well. And an element of sort of guilting people into not talking about.
Oh, I see. So sort of a kind of don't look at me doing this kind of thing, as in I'm going to come out in support of Black Lives Matter so that you don't notice the other terrible things I'm doing. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, so interesting. Have you got an example of a kind of a company that you might suspect of that kind of practice?
I think like I say, like Amazon, I don't know the specific examples of what they've said they've been doing in relation to Black Lives Matter, but I think they've certainly done stuff on social media in relation to saying, again, like we've been taking time to reflect as a company, that line, and then turning the conversation away from something that they
other challenges that people
right now,
accountable for. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I guess it all feeds the same kind of debate that we've been trying to unpick, which is how do you as a customer or a consumer orient yourself to what you're being told to believe, what you want to believe, what you suspect might be the case, the role of transparency, what we ask for transparency about, and how we can get to sort of better visibility. And we're coming into the last 2 minutes. Belinda has solved the challenge of how to get emojis in the chat, which is a breakthrough moment. Again, the marketers just giving and giving and giving, constant value add here. I'm going to just come back to Belinda briefly. Now we've got 2 minutes to go. We can just sort out this whole racism, capitalism thing. For a last word on this, before I try and do a little wrap up, Belinda, you mentioned at the beginning that you were feeling optimistic. If we were to come back in a year and have another go at this topic, let's say, what are the things that you would want to be saying had happened that would make you feel like your optimism had been justified today?
I don't know. That's such a tough question. I'll point to some of the things that I'm trying to do, which is I'm trying to help companies who I think really honestly want to figure this out and are stuck in many ways. I'm trying to help them get out of their own way and figure out what does that look like. So for me, again, I think this is a very internal problem. I think this is a culture problem. For me, I think what I would love to have happened a year from now is to come back and say, look, there are these 5 things that we've all agreed on that every company needs to do at the bare minimum to not continue fostering and facilitating abusive workplaces. And actually, if we just have like mass awareness and perfect knowledge of what those things are, I think that's a huge win in and of itself. One of the things that makes this issue a bit murky is people with bad intentions are able to say, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. This is really tough. And people with good intentions are saying, oh, I really don't know what I'm supposed to do. This is so tough. Yeah. So I think if we can solve that number 1 challenge, that's a great way to tease out people who care versus people who don't, by saying, listen, we've all agreed as humanity that this is the minimum that all of you need to be doing. So now if there's a reason that you're not doing it, we understand that, and we can make better educated guesses about your intentions and about whether we want to support you, whether we want to work with you, or whether we want to work for you. So I think we're still at a very early stage of just surfacing what good looks like, of coalescing around what we are asking for, so that we can use that to hold people accountable.
Thank you so much. And maybe in a year we will reconvene, but next time on a yacht in Cannes, and have this conversation again. I definitely think that's a good plan. And we're already a minute over. I'm so sorry, and I know everybody will want to get out and on with their day, enjoy the sunshine. I would just want to leave with three thoughts. I mean, I've written a ton of notes, and there's some really interesting things for us, I think, for us to take forward. Firstly, this point about transparency. The data is good, but it comes with the lived experience, and this idea that the time for lip service is, if not over, then certainly running out very quickly, and we will require evidential stuff to come out of organisations, even if what the evidence says now is not what anybody wants it to be. At least if we know what it is, then that's a step in the right direction. Secondly, I think Bex's point was really interesting about it's not, in addition to the sort of representation of all these different kind of intersectional representation in the actual advertising that comes out at the end of it. Are we surprised that that data is disappointing when the researchers who advise on it, the planners, the creatives, when there's poor representation or indeed poor toxic cultures in the back end to produce that work? Clearly we're not. I was completely fascinated by what Asad said about intrinsic and extrinsic motivations at different life stages, and how perhaps Generation Z are going to grow into a different type of senior management cohort than the ones we have now. I hope that we don't have to wait for the generation to get there in order for that to sort of make material change, but I'm interested in that as a sort of generational shift. And tons of other stuff. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. I feel like we've kind of got a bit of somewhere, but thank you so much, of course, to Bex, to Asad, and to Belinda at the crack of dawn in New York, and to everybody who's joined us today. It's been a really, I found, interesting and stimulating conversation. So good luck, everybody. Continue to do the right thing in your organisations, and I'll see you on a yacht this time next year. Thank you very much. Oh, and thank you very much to Santander, who are the partner of Sensemaker Live. I nearly forgot. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye.